Hi guys, welcome back. This is video 7 of the Unreal Engine 4 inventory video series. We have got up to a point where we can add objects into our inventory. So just to give you a quick show, if we go over to our items, we can press E to pick these up and press I to show our inventory. So we have the health pack itself, it's a singular item, it's pulling through all the correct information, and likewise the ammo pack is a stackable item and it's pulling through the correct information as well. We don't really have anything that we can do just yet, so we're going to have a look at how we can get some functionality for the menus, and we'll just firstly start with looking at actually pulling up the menu itself, pulling through the correct information to kind of get the contextualized information for the pop-up menu, and then just closing it down as well. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to have a look inside the slot widget blueprint itself. What we need to do is basically create a new variable which will store the index value for the slot itself. We're going to do this because we need to have a way that when we click on an item within the inventory, we need to have a method to pass on which actual index was actually clicked. So the easiest way to do this is just to add a new variable which we'll call slot clicked, and we're going to make this a integer. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about kind of passing information between blueprints. We've done a little bit of casting to make sure that objects or kind of input variables are the type of object that we're expecting. The next type of message passing we're going to have a look at is using event dispatchers. Now, event dispatchers are really simple. Basically, you can kind of trigger them through events and then kind of call them on inside other blueprints that sort of implement the blueprint that you're currently working in. So because we know that our slot widget is a part of the inventory widget, we should be able to use event dispatchers to pass information between them. So we're going to click to create a new event dispatcher. We're going to call this one slot clicked. Slot was clicked. There we go. And event dispatchers are great because you can actually pass through information with certain variables. So with ours, we want to pass through which slot was actually clicked. So in the inputs, we're just going to click new, and we're just going to call this one slot clicked, and we're going to call this, we're going to make it an integer, sorry. So to actually trigger the event dispatcher, we need some kind of event. So the event that we're going to use is the actual slot button clicked event itself. So make sure you select the slot button variable from the variables list, and we just want to grab the onClicked event from the details down here. So onClicked slot button, what we're going to do is we're just going to call slot was clicked. And you can see that these event dispatcher nodes actually have this little envelope as well, which kind of gives you an indication as to what this node does. It's a method for passing information, for sending messages basically. So we can pass through which slot was clicked. All that's going to be is the slot clicked variable. Now, to assign this slot clicked variable to each instance of the slot, we need to make sure that it is a public variable because we want to set each instance within the inventory widget itself. So once that's all done, just hit compile and just minimize the slot widget blueprint, and we're just going to jump back into the inventory blueprint. So each individual slot instance here in the uniform grid panel needs to have its default value for that slot clicked integer set to whichever array index it actually is. So slot 0 is going to be 0 still, so we don't need to change that, but we do need to change each of the other slots as per their position within the slot array. There you go. So just make sure you compile that as well. And let's just jump back over into the graph. And from where we set each of the variables from the slot reference, we're going to include a do once node, because we only want to fire this once, and we're going to run another for each loop. And this for each loop is going to run through our slot array. There we go. From the for each loop, we're going to have a look at the array element here, and we're just going to say bind event to slot was clicked. Now the idea with this bind event is that once we get the message passed through, we can basically trigger another event to happen from this message pass. So we're going to pass through the loop body through to the event bind event to slot was clicked, and from the event here, we're just going to click and drag, and we're going to create a new custom event. And we're going to name this one button was clicked. Now what you'll see is, because we created the event from the event delegate here, from the event the binding, you can see that we've actually pulled through the information that we sent through from the event dispatch, which is great. We can now specify which slot was clicked depending on which array element. So if we click on this one here, we will end up sending through the slot clicked would be number 1, because that would be number 1 inside of the slot array. Cool. So what we're going to do is, because we're going to probably use this a lot in the next couple of kind of bits of code, we're going to promote this to its own variable. And we're just going to call this one slot clicked. So we have a local variable of this to use. So button was clicked. What we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at how we can pop up the menu and how we can pull through the correct information that we need. So we're going to need a copy of our game instance for this. So we're going to click and drag that from the left, and we're going to get inventory. Now from the inventory, we're going to get a reference. And in terms of the array index, well, we can just grab our slot clicked and feed that into there. And as usual, we can break the item data so we can start to see what information it was that we need. So before we progress from here, we're just going to have a quick look at what exactly, which information exactly that we need to set. So if we just jump back to the designer, and let's just have a look over in our widget hierarchy over here. I'm just going to collapse everything up. Now we're not going to focus on the toss menus just yet. We're just going to have a look at the actual item menu. So if you remember when we created this, we created some text at the top, 3 buttons, and some text on each button. The toss item button is going to be very generic. It applies across all items within our inventory. The close button, likewise, all it's going to do is close off this this window here, so that's fine. But we do need to pull some bindings through for this text at the top here and this text on the button here. So the top button here is going to be our generic use item button. And I say generic because we'll use this button to implement the functionality of anything within these slots here, but we do need to contextualize it to whatever object it was that we clicked. So these two are both text. So let's jump back into the graph, and we're just going to create a couple of more variables here. So I'm going to create one which is going to be called pickup name, and another one which is going to be called pickup action text. So just make sure you set these both to text because that's what they are. And from our break item data, we're going to set the pickup name. So let's set up pickup name, and we're also going to set up the pickup action text. There we go. Cool. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is actually get that menu to be able to be seen on screen. So if we just jump back to the designer and with that item menu selected again, have a look over in the details. If you remember back a couple of videos, we set this visibility to hidden by default. We're not going to create a binding because we don't really need to have that level of detail. We can just simply call a set visibility node to set this to be visible. So if we go back to the graph, after the pickup action text, we're just going to run a set visibility node function. So it's going to ask what is it that you want to make visible, and it's asking for a widget. So we're just going to use our item menu. So just over here in the variable list, we're just going to click and drag item menu into the target there. And by default it's set to visible, which is great, so we can leave that as it is. Now again, just as a bit of a fail-safe, once we've clicked this button and we've opened up this little menu here, we want to make sure that we can't accidentally click anything else. That was the whole point of putting the close button on this text box here, that we can close this menu before we go back to look at anything else. So what we're going to do is, back in the graph, we're going to create some more variables. So we're going to create firstly a variable called inventory enabled. We're going to make sure this is set to be a boolean, and we're going to set it to well, we need to compile it first, and we need to set it to be true by default, because when we press the letter I key on our keyboard, we want to make sure that the inventory is enabled by default. So if we quickly jump back to the designer, let's just select the inventory panel, and just in the behavior section you can see that there is enabled. We're going to add a binding, but we're just going to add the actual property. We don't need to create a function to pull data. We're just going to use the property itself. So it is enabled by default, so when we press the letter I, this will be enabled. But in our graph, we want to make sure that inventory enabled is set to false, because we don't want to be able to click anything accidentally behind the menu. So let's just compile that one. Let's give it a quick test. We haven't made a way to close the menu, so it's just going to be a very simple quick test to make sure things are working. So if we press play, let's go over and pick up our health pack. And if we click on it now, we now get our text block. And it's not pulling through the text, and that's because I haven't actually set the binding for the text yet. But it's good to see that the menu is popping up. So let's just escape out of that. We need to make sure these variables that I've set here, that we actually link the text to get these to actually show up properly. So we want, firstly, inside the vertical box, this top text block here, we're just going to set the binding to be pickup name. And for the first button, which I actually haven't named here properly, so I'm just going to take some time just to get these names. This is going to be the use button. This is going to be the toss button, and this is going to be the close button. There we go. So the use button text, that needs to be bound to the pickup action text. Okay, so if we compile that, let's just give that another quick test now, and let's have a look. If you press I, there we go. So you can see that it's pulling through the correct information for the object name. It's pulling through the correct text for the use item text as well. So that's great. Everything seems to be working just fine. One thing that we'll have to have a look at is when we open and close the menu as well, that it is basically it needs to kind of close all menus as well. So we'll have a quick look at how we can get some events to get that working in a little bit. So let's just go back into the inventory widget blueprint. Let's go back to the graph, and what we'll do, actually, just for a bit of housekeeping, we'll just quickly comment these sections here, just so we know what's what. So this is setting references. This section here is to loop through the array, loop through visual and data arrays. This section here is setting variables for each slot. Just make sure we make that nice and tidy. And this section here is just to open up the item menu. Ooh. So checking which button was clicked, opening the item menu. Cool. Okay, so let's have a look at what we need to do to get the item menu to close. So we're going to need the close button. So make sure we select the close button. And we're going to run an on-clicked event. Now, Unreal always helpfully does that. It moves things over to the side. In fact, we'll just pop this down here. And what we're going to do for the on-click close button is we need to, well, let's have a look. Let's go through it logically what we need to do. The menu will be opened, so we want to make sure that this menu gets closed down. So it's going to be quite a simple one. Where all we're going to do basically is run that set visibility node again. We're going to make sure that it's the item menu that is made invisible, so hidden. And we also want to make sure that we set the inventory itself to be enabled again. So let's just grab the inventory enable button and we'll just set it back to be enabled. Now, kind of similar to what we did here with where we looped through the arrays, we set an additional custom event to make sure we could loop through here after we'd run our initial event construct. We're going to do a very similar thing here because we want to make sure that this sort of functionality here is quite generic. It's in terms of hiding menus and things like that. We want to make sure that if we close the inventory whilst we have a menu open, which is something that we could do, we could have a look at that at sorting that functionality out to disable pressing the letter I if any menus were open. But a simpler, cleaner fix would just be to add another custom event here. So add custom event, and what we want to do is we'd want to just say, let's just call this one action complete. And the idea here is that action complete will set all menus hidden and enable the inventory. So if we just compile this, let's go into the first person character for where we have our toggle menu. So what we want to do is not inside the add to inventory, inside the event graph itself. Let's have a look for our inventory functionality. So what we want to do is with this is before we remove from parent, we just want to call action complete. And what that's going to do is it's going to basically it's going to close off any item menus and things like that. It will set the inventory to be enabled again, and it'll basically just kind of reset the menus. So if we compile this, let's just give this a quick little test and see what happens. So we can press the letter I, we can press the I, toggle off, everything seems to be working fine. We can press E to grab our items. If you press the letter I, we get our inventory. We can click the health pack. We have our health pack heal me. We can press close and that takes us back to the inventory. We can click on the ammo pack. You can see that the contextualized information is pulling through correctly there as well. We can press close, and then just to double check, if we have a menu open and we close the inventory, let's just open the inventory back up and you can see that it closes all of those menus for us. So it's a nice, clean, easy fix. So we'll wrap up this video there for now. Just to quickly recap what we've had a look through in today's video. We've had a look at, firstly, in the slot widget, we've had a look at using event dispatchers to send information through. We created a new variable to handle the index of the array of slots. In the inventory widget, we made sure that each slot has its own slot clicked index value. In the graph, we call our event dispatcher, and we assign an event to trigger when that event dispatcher message gets sent. We pull through information from our item data to ensure that the names and action text and everything like that kind of gets pulled through correctly, and we pull up our item menu. In terms of closing off the item menu, let's just give this a comment as well. This is just to close item menu, and we're basically performing a simple action complete to basically reset any menus if we close the inventory without closing any item menus. So in the next video, we'll have a look at setting up the toss item functionality. There's a little bit of work to do there because we obviously have items which stack and items which don't stack.